Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Ever considered the question, should Poland talk to Russia? Now, just posing that question today in Poland, well, for many, it feels like a betrayal of the state. And honestly, this, in the long run, could really become a problem for Polish foreign policy. You know, I don't think I need to prove my credentials on this particular subject, but let me be crystal clear. I'm not talking about some kind of pro-Russian political agenda here. Not at all. The heart of the matter is this. If Poland truly aspires to be a regional force, an indispensable and irreversible part of any significant political balance in this corner of Europe, then we simply can't always count on someone else to do the heavy lifting. We can't always rely on others to negotiate the terms of division, the economic conditions, the military arrangements, supposedly in our name, someone from outside our region, some external Western power, because inevitably, that path leads to a dangerous risk. The risk that we become the object of those negotiations, rather than a shaper of them. Today, we're tackling the great dilemma of isolating Russia. All right, let's talk about Russia. For hundreds of years, Russia has been, at the very least, a rival to Poland, and far more often, a deadly enemy. Think about it. Since the fall of the First Polish Republic, Russia, in its various incarnations, has dominated at least part of Poland for roughly 73% of the time. Of course, history isn't one-sided. There were earlier periods of this rivalry where Poland actually held the upper hand. The Battle of Clushino in 1610? That was certainly a high point for Polish dominance. But the broader trend, especially since the Mongols dismantled the old Rus's order, and since an imperial, aggressive, expansive power with its capital in Moscow rose from those ashes, well, Russia has consistently been the most critical point of reference for Polish Eastern policy. In fact, Polish policy towards all our other Eastern partners is fundamentally shaped by our stance towards Moscow. Now, I know, since the war in Ukraine began, we've heard a lot of theories, a lot of views suggesting that Russia is finished, that it's on the brink of collapse, that it'll fall apart any day now. And look, that vision? It's certainly evocative. It captures the imagination. But if we're being honest with ourselves, I believe two other assumptions are much safer, much more probable. First, Russia will exist. It will endure. And second, as soon as it gets back on its feet, it will strive for further expansion. Why? Because that's just how the Russian state operates. We can see it plain as day in the history books, going back hundreds of years. Nothing fundamentally changes in that state ideology. So, Russia will almost certainly remain the key point of reference in this part of Europe, in our part of the world, for the foreseeable future. And this means we have to assume that, just like in the past, just like right now, the status of our region, and indeed the status of Poland itself, will largely be determined in relation to the Russian Federation. And this brings us to a point that is, on one hand, so blindingly obvious, it almost doesn't need saying. You just need to think about it for a moment. But on the other hand, it's something that's become almost unsayable in Poland today. Here it is. In international politics, you don't just talk to your friends. You don't just talk to those you want to talk to. You also have to talk to those you need to talk to. Why? Because sometimes there's simply no other way. Diplomacy isn't just for allies. It's also for engaging with opponents, even with mortal enemies. That's what high-level politics is for. Look at the Americans. They consider the People's Republic of China an existential threat. And precisely because of that, they are constantly talking to the Chinese. They're trying to establish the framework of their rivalry, to discuss how that competition will unfold. Or take the Ukrainians. They are, out of necessity, forced into some form of political dialogue with the Russian Federation. And believe me, Russia isn't exactly thrilled about these conversations either. From their perspective, they'd much rather be dictating terms about Ukraine to some other major power. But circumstances force these countries to at least simulate some form of political dialogue. Because international politics isn't just about the conversations you want to have. It's about the conversations you need to have. Because those are the prevailing conditions. And if you don't have them, well, then someone else will have those conversations for you, and about you. Now, let me be perfectly clear. Poland's goal is to limit Russia's influence on European politics. That, to me, is absolutely obvious. As soon as the conditions are right, Russian isolation must be deepened. When the Russians, to put it bluntly, overextend themselves. When they realize their goals are incompatible with Western policies. Or when the general climate shifts towards isolating Russia and curbing political and economic ties between the West and the Russian Federation, then yes, Poland's role is to push for that deeper isolation. Why? Because it's precisely those relationships between Russia and the Western world that often give Moscow the leverage it uses to diminish the status of Central and Eastern Europe. Think about it. Russia is a threat to Poland. That's a given. But Russia cooperating extensively with the West? That becomes a deadly threat to Poland. Russia needed Western partners to partition Poland in the past. During World War II, it invaded Poland first alongside the Germans, and then waged war with material support from the West, primarily from the United States. Russia attacked Ukraine after a period of intensified economic cooperation with Western countries. The deepening of political or economic cooperation between the West and Russia has been an almost unfailing predictor of another wave, another expansion of Russian imperialism in our region. Seriously, I struggle to think of an example where this pattern doesn't hold true. So, it's clearly in our interest. If the conditions exist to isolate Russia, to sever those economic and political ties between the West and Russia, we should be working towards that. And if, as is the case now, there are conditions to use Western resources to stop Russia, well, the current political conditions are, frankly, almost unbelievably favorable. It seems to me that we still don't fully appreciate what an incredible window of opportunity opened up after the Russian aggression in Ukraine. The fact that such vast Western resources are being committed to halting the Russian Federation. However, and this is a big however, whether Russia is truly isolated doesn't solely depend on Poland. Poland has some influence, yes, but it's very, very limited. If the United States, Germany, or France don't isolate Russia, and Poland tries to do it alone, well, in reality, Russia isn't isolated. Instead, Poland gets excluded from the crucial discussions about the future of our region of Europe. And I think this is a particularly good time to bring this up, because that sanitary cordon, that wall of isolation built around Russia after the aggression in February 2022, it's visibly cracking, right before our eyes. One of the most significant developments impacting the entire political dynamic around the war and beyond is the American withdrawal of Russia from political isolation. It's hard to find a clearer trend. For the Americans, dialogue with the Russians has often been a primary tool of policy towards our region, and a broader instrument used to exert pressure on Europe. Let's be honest, in recent months, the Americans have been talking to the Russians more often than they've been talking to Poland. This is happening at various technical levels, at high political levels. We've even seen 2-hour talks between presidents. America is, effectively, ending the isolation of Russia. What's more, President Donald Trump has explicitly said that this isolation of Russia was one of the reasons for the outbreak of the war. He admitted that excluding Russia from forums like the G8 led to the conflict because, as he put it, they didn't talk to the Russians. And it's clear he sees Russia not just as a party to discuss the war in Ukraine with, but as a potential business partner, a significant point of reference in the global political system from the U.S. perspective. This situation, where the Americans are already openly talking to the Russians, will inevitably lead, over time, to European countries doing the same. I mean, European nations won't be able to stand by for long while the strategic dialogue shaping our continent happens without their involvement. Sooner or later, perhaps with reluctance, perhaps even with a show of theatrical hostility, but the Germans, the French, they will start exploring ideas. Maybe we should talk to these Russians about what peaceful solutions might look like. And what then? This is where political correctness would have me launch into a tirade of European platitudes. You know, we need European unity, cooperation within the European Union, and so on. And yes, to some extent, that's true. The European Union will be a battleground. A significant portion of the struggles we face will play out there, because sanctions are imposed by the EU, and there will be ongoing battles to maintain them. The future economic relationship between Russia and Europe will largely be shaped within the EU framework. So yes, that front is undeniably important. But let's not kid ourselves. The key discussions, the truly pivotal ones, will happen, because they are already happening at the state-to-state level. The idea that we can just delegate this role to someone else, that someone, on our behalf, can take care of securing Poland's national interests within this grand discussion, that's simply not a viable option for anyone who envisions a truly sovereign state, not a subordinate one. I mean, a situation where, concerning the Russian Federation, our space, the space that directly affects us, is negotiated by whichever Western power happens to be the strongest at the moment. In the long run, that should be utterly unacceptable to us, because it creates a potentially lethal threat. Of course, I'm talking about the long term here, because today's Poland, well, it possesses neither the tools nor, frankly, the political culture capable of changing this state of affairs. Accusations of being pro-Russian, of agency, of betrayal. These have become the daily bread of Polish political life. And it's difficult to put into words just how foolish this is, how damaging it is to the Polish state in the long run. I mean, we are creating the perfect conditions for actual foreign interference in our country. If everyone is accusing everyone else of being pro-Russian and a traitor, then what do pro-Russian and traitor even mean anymore? They become abstract, hollowed-out terms. This is just one of many, many pieces of evidence pointing to a profound immaturity in Polish public life, within the Polish political class. It's all sacrificed for the sake of current political squabbles. But the consequences? They could end up being far, far worse. Something to think about. Thank you so much for your attention. Take care, and I'll see you next time.